Hello everyone, welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Review Roundup. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the latest and sometimes greatest films coming to a cinema near you. Today we are talking about Regretting You. This is directed by Josh Boone. Morgan Grant and her daughter Clara explore what's left behind after a devastating accident reveals a shocking betrayal and forces them to confront family secrets, redefine love, and rediscover each other. But before we go any further, if you haven't yet, please like the video. It really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way, you never miss reviews like this. This is going to be a mainly pseudo-spoiler review, but we can and will get into spoilers, full spoilers, at the end, so I can read out your questions and your comments. To that end, leave questions and comments. If you're watching this live, first of all, welcome. Second of all, conversations like this are always more interesting when we can have a dialogue. So as I'm kind of going through my own thoughts, let me know what you think. Unless it's something like offensive, I will read every comment and question from the live chat. If you're watching this after the fact, we're still super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description so you can kind of jump around at your leisure. And you should definitely subscribe so that you can join us live next time. So, kind of starting off from a bird's eye view here, the thing about this film is that it's kind of preposterous, right? The film's preposterous premise feels a lot more like a soap opera or a TV movie that feels more like those than like a theatrical feature. And again, the letterbox blurb I gave you there doesn't really do it justice, because basically, if you watch the trailer, you'll notice that a woman's husband and sister die in a car crash, but they're together, and it's because they were having an affair. And then on top of all that, the sister's husband is the main woman in this convoluted web of connection. That's her real true love, and it's this like very convoluted kind of melodramatic thing, right? And I think on some level, Paramount, who is distributing this, understands this, right? So they've thrown like $30 million at this Colleen Hoover novel adaptation. Of course, Colleen Hoover, the author of It Ends With Us, which was a very financially successful, at the very least, film from last year that, of course, spawned all of this drama, behind the scenes on-set drama between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. And I think on some level, but that wasn't by Paramount, so it's interesting to see here, Paramount do this, but nevertheless, I think they're hoping to kind of have a little repeat here. But looking at the box office, for this movie, it doesn't look like lightning, I guess, does not strike twice, right? But they've thrown all this money at this to kind of give what is ostensibly like a very like melodramatic, schmaltzy kind of story, and give it like a more respectable coat of paint, right? But the film, I think one of the main issues with the film is that it's torn between that outlandish setup that I just described, and a fairly conventional teen drama, right? Morgan, the mom, played by Allison Williams, easily has the most interesting narrative between the two, between her and her daughter Clara, played by McKenna Grace here, pictured down below. And the biggest issue here is that these two storylines rarely parallel one another when they so readily could have, right? As it seems, the two narratives don't really have much to say about each other, or give you more insight into one by means of the other, right? As I was watching, I was almost imagining or anticipating, and then ultimately this anticipation was unfounded. It never happened. That I thought they were gonna kind of go down the road of Clara kind of repeating the mistakes of her mother, and that would ultimately make this a story about how cycles both repeat, but they also change. Like there's obviously the particularities, but there's a kind of broad cyclical things that happen from generation to generation, and that ultimately doesn't matter if Morgan has already made those mistakes. Even if she were to tell Claire about those, it doesn't really matter, right? Because A, Claire's not going to take it seriously, but also B, just on principle, Clara has to make these mistakes because it's her life, right? It doesn't matter if she knows it didn't work for her mom. We, as human beings, we gotta kind of we kind of sometimes have to learn the hard lessons in order to kind of have that growth. But the conventions of the genre that this film is in kind of foreclose on this option, foreclose on this kind of paralleling of the storylines, because ultimately that would mean that Claire's making a bunch of mistakes. And of course she does make mistakes in this film, but I mean kind of these like big macro life-changing mistakes. But we can't have that, right? There has to be this happy ending where everything gets more or less resolved in like this neat little bow. And there was like a lot of parts of this movie that had major like girl who's going to be okay vibes, like if you know that meme, right? And again, this is just something that's kind of part and parcel of the quote unquote chick flick genre, which, admittedly is an incredibly reductive and, possibly even misogynistic label to still be using in 2025. But I think its application is useful here, right? Anecdotally, the screening I went to, the audience was like primarily teenage girls. I think I do remember, it ends with us kind of being, I know that was like one of the things that was part of the whole drama and discourse, was how kind of Blake Lively, the filmmakers, were trying to kind of position that film as like a film you go with all your girlfriends and you all go, right? And again, that was a very similar kind of thing. And that's the kind of books Colleen Hoover writes. And in this genre attribution of it being a quote unquote chick flick isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? But the reason why I'm bringing this up is nevertheless, it's going to follow these beats. It needs that satisfying, gooey kind of ending. And speaking of that ending, like that last like 5 or 7 minutes, easily the worst part of the film. Because all of these loose threads all get tied up really quickly. And I wouldn't even say they get tied up. The more so they're just like, oh yeah, and by the way, this thing is happening. And they're like, whoa! Right? Like it's like it all kind of just gets wrapped up. Like there's no room for more emotional ambiguity, right? Obviously there's the ambiguity of like where these characters are going to go going forward, but emotionally everything is pretty wrapped up by the time the credits roll. And ultimately, what does the film really have to say? And I'm not really quite sure. And obviously not every film needs to have some broad, big idea that it's kind of, putting the feather in its cap, so to speak. But director Josh Boone and screenwriter Susan McMartin, they struggle to kind of find a compelling shape for this story. And as a result, the film is structurally meandering, right? Kind of, it's not very, it's not entirely clear what the arc is meant to be other than emotional resolution. Right. And I think that's kind of like one of the things that, that'd be one of the critiques that people would make derisively about the chick flick genre, is that on some level it's kind of like wish fulfillment, right? For women who have very difficult lives, just by nature of being women, right? Getting to have a story where there's ridiculous conflicts, right? But then they all get resolved at the end. There's something very cathartic about that, right? Even for a non-woman such as myself, right? But again, it's not really clear what this film is trying to say other than giving that emotional resolution. Perhaps the idea here, and I say perhaps, I think this is the idea, but again, it's so kind of trite and tired of an idea that it almost feels it's too obvious. But I guess the idea here is that life just doesn't always work out in the way that you planned, and not even just like it's different, like in ways that are demonstrably worse than other options, right? So of course Morgan should have ended up with Dave Franco's character here originally. But that's just not how life happened. It's not like, but my life, it's just as good, just different. No, like objectively it would have been better that way. But even these objectively worse outcomes can still bring about uniquely beautiful and valuable things. And in this case, Morgan having Clara, right? That would not have happened had she ended up with Dave Franco's character. But looking here at the characters, kind of a little segue, right? You'd be forgiven thinking, if you'd be forgiven for thinking that I completely hated this film. That's not the case. Not so. Because it's really in the performances, presumably by consequence of Boone's direction, but it's so nebulous when it comes to performances in a film. It's in these performances. It's the performances that bring a pathos to the melodrama. And everyone is taking this so seriously that it's like Boone and the rest of the cast didn't realize what kind of movie they were making, right? And I think that's a good thing, right? Because again, on paper, this could really just be like, supermarket romance novel quality kind of thing. Again, I've never read a Colleen Hoover novel. I don't want to impugn her work, but again, like these are, we're not talking about War and Peace here, nor have I read War and Peace. I'm a fake literature fan, right? But it's these performances that make the film not only passable, but occasionally, if infrequently, but occasionally compelling, right? This movie is not devoid of interest, so to speak, right? And I like I mentioned before, it's fitting that the best performance in the film is associated with the most interesting character, Morgan, played by Allison Williams, right? She's always been a very likable actress. But again, just on a script level, Morgan is the character who has the most room to grow, right? Because her life, because basically the prologue to this is that, she gets pregnant by her teenage, high school boyfriend when they're teenagers, and that kind of, locks her into a certain life path. And as a consequence of that, certain other paths get closed off. So her life, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic because, both on principle as well as what the film is trying to say, it's not like her life was ruined, right? Because she gets this great experience. But at least in terms of agency in determining her life path, that agency was taken from her, right? But now that with her husband, her adulterous husband, and we'll get into that, adulterous husband is gone, and Clara soon to leave college, Morgan now finally has the opportunity to exercise some agency and be her own person. I keep going on about the adult side of this, and while it is the adult storyline that's more narratively interesting, it's the relationship, that side of it is more narratively interesting, but the relationship between Clara and Miller, right, pictured at the top here, it oozes chemistry, two very beautiful young actors, right? I am just a sucker for suburban teenage romantic drama. I just get swept up. It could be like the most mediocre movie and I just get into it. Though the dialogue can be, the dialogue for the entire film can be kind of clunky, but it is with this relationship where it is at its clunkiest. There's a part, so Dave Franco is not only the childhood friend of Morgan and also the widow of Morgan's sister, but he's also a teacher at the high school. And he's trying to kind of mentor Miller, who wants to get into film school. And there's a line, I'm going to paraphrase it, but this isn't that far off, where he's like, hey, Miller, here's the brochure for that film festival. It would look good when you're applying to that film program. The one, it's very tell, not show. Tell, don't show, right? It's very, on the nose, very clumsy and crude. And it's as a aspiring writer myself, it's very easy to identify when you go, oh, that line is there because the screenwriter is trying to accomplish this, right? The mark of good screenwriting is that it's invisible, right? You're not thinking about the writer's intentions in that kind of way, right? Where you're literally oh, that one sentence is literally there because they're trying to make sure this point gets across or whatever it might be, right? But by far the weakest link in the film is Morgan's husband Chris and then her sister Jenny, right? And because it's their off-screen infidelity that, not only infidelity but infidelity with each other, that is really the driving force of the narrative, right? And by the end of the movie seems to posit that they weren't really bad people. They were just human, right? And three-dimensional and complicated and, and at one point Morgan Allison Williams' character even tells Claire, is like, I don't want you to think less of them, because they did a lot of really great things and they were really great people in certain aspects, right? But this framing really falls flat on its face because we never see this, right? The two characters are pretty unlikable while they're alive. And it's pretty obvious from the jump, even if you hadn't seen the trailer, that we're supposed to be apprehensive about them. But then once they tragically get killed in a car accident, it's not really a lot of screen time for them. So we don't really get enough time with them to then be able to rewatch those scenes and retroactively apply these different shades of complexity to them. I'm not sure how you would remedy this issue, other than just like axing that 11th hour reframing of like, oh, like they weren't bad people. And I'm not trying to make a philosophical argument that like people are ontologically bad. I'm just saying like, I feel like the movie just doesn't do the work in order to make that framing satisfying, because I'm like, I just feel like you've given me zero reason to give them the benefit of the doubt of like, we're all human and there's complexity. Maybe at one point they discover letters between them, and it's like a whole thing of, do we read them? And then eventually the decision is just to throw them in the fireplace, right? Maybe we could have read those letters, right? And we could have gotten a sense of their interior lives, right? And their own wants and needs. And, because ultimately everyone's the main character of their own story. So, maybe it's because they Chris was feeling trapped or something. Like, this is not to justify their infidelity, but it will at least give us some more insight into them as being three-dimensional. But all we get are kind of cardboard cutouts. And then we're just told, like, we're already given them, they're already one-dimensional when we encounter them. And then we later find out all of this infidelity happened off-screen, and they're dead now, so they can't answer for it. And it's like, as it stands, they just come off as selfish and untrustworthy partners, And I think the film probably could have, would have stuck the landing a little bit more if it had a better sense of how are we supposed to kind of take this whole situation. And again, it's hard to tell how much of this film's strengths, with the ones that are there, right? How much of those can be attributed to the director, right? Josh Boone. His filmography, most of his work obviously lines up with the demands of this film, barring the New Mutants, right? Which I believe was like his last feature that he did, which obviously is considered not only one of the worst X-Men movies or one of the worst but which is like one of the worst movies ever made. Trapped in development hell. They shot it and then like it didn't come out for 3 years, and they were trying to edit it, and people had went through puberty. It was like this whole thing, right? But I remember, I've only seen it the one time, but I saw it in theaters. I remember really liking The Fault in Our Stars, right? The John Green adaptation. And John Green, his work can also kind of fall into like the chick flick genre, or at least the genre with those attributes of, female wish fulfillment, right? And again, this is not a dig at, because the default of most stories for decades have been male wish fulfillment. So again, I'm not throwing particular blame or shade on the chick flick, right? But it's, So my point is with Josh Boone, he has some experience with this kind of film. And both with The Fault in Our Stars and then this film, he's taking otherwise formulaic or schmaltzy material and bringing, or at least trying to bring, more color and texture to it, right? And like I said, the Paramount did throw like $30 million at that, and you see that with the actors. Like, I wouldn't say any of these people are huge stars, but like Allison Williams is recognizable by name and appearance. Dave Franco similarly. I think McKenna Grace and I forget the boy's name, but the boy who plays Miller Adams, her boyfriend, I think he's also kind of like an up and coming actor. So there's like a lot here. And if nothing else, the film is competently shot, right? It's nothing crazy. Nothing that's going to get nominated for any cinematography awards, but it definitely doesn't look like it's a soap opera TV movie. And that's kind of what I was saying before, where it feels like a TV movie in big budget feature clothing. and it's just I think there was a lot more, like they really did. I think there's a lot that was done here to enhance this a little bit, right? Now it's time for your questions and comments, but no one's left a question or comment. I see that we do have some concurrent viewers right now. If you have any questions or comments about this movie, or you want to ask me more things about how I felt about the movie, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to read any question or comment that you put, as long as it's not offensive. This is like one of the reasons why I've decided to do more live reviews, rather than just doing like pre-recorded interviews or just doing written reviews, which is like what I used to do. This is so much more interesting, both for you guys and for me, if I'm able to kind of, if we can kind of have a dialogue. And in the past, some people have left comments and, bring up things I hadn't even thought about, or things I did think about but forgot to write in my notes. And it just always makes the experience more fruitful for both parties here. So I'll leave this be for now, but if you're watching next time, leave a comment or question. Don't be shy and don't be scared. But overall here, kind of wrapping things up, I think this movie is a lot better than it could have been, and a lot better than I think people are giving it credit for. It definitely struggles with having a more cohesive narrative, and really falls into a lot of the same pitfalls that so many romantic dramas or TV movies, especially, like I keep mentioning, kind of fall into. But I don't know, there's just something about it. The insane premise is very compelling. It almost makes me want to rewrite this movie, because I think there's just like a lot of potential here narratively that the film just doesn't quite capitalize on, but the performances are strong enough that I was never bored, and even the parts that weren't good, I just kind of rolled my eyes and went like, okay, yeah, of course, whatever. So, controversially, I think I'm going to give this a 7. And I don't even know if it deserves a 7, but it feels like I wouldn't mind rewatching this. I think that's my mark between a 6 and a 7, is that both are like a net positive, but a 6 is something where it's like, respect the game, understand there's some good elements here, but if I never watch this again, I don't mind. Whereas like I would be, if someone was like, do you want to watch this? This movie, I wouldn't be like, oh God, please. No, I wouldn't feel as tedious. So I don't know. Again, that's very, I know this is controversial, because on Letterboxd, I think it has like a 2.7 out of 5 or something. So, giving a 3.5 out of 5 is definitely going against the grain, but that's just me. I'm a maverick. I push against the envelope. But that's it. That's it for this installment of Review Roundup. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like the video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? And this way, you're never gonna miss a video. And don't forget to comment below and let me know what you think of Regretting You. Until next time, peace out.